had always been the kind of person who needed to get away from everything from time to time. The chaos of daily life, the noise, the crowds. Sometimes it felt like I couldn't breathe. So, when the opportunity to spend a weekend alone in a remote cabin in the woods came up, I jumped at it. I had found it online, a small, tucked-away cabin that seemed like the perfect spot to escape. It was located a few hours outside of town, far from civilization, and that was exactly what I needed. A peaceful, quiet place to recharge and clear my head. I packed my things. A few changes of clothes, food for the weekend, my camera, and a good book. The road to the cabin was long and winding, the kind of road that seemed to stretch on forever, surrounded by thick trees and little else. The more I drove, the more I felt like I was being pulled into the wilderness, and that idea started to thrill me. The cabin was exactly as the listing described it, small, wooden, and isolated. It sat at the edge of a clearing, with tall pine trees surrounding it on all sides. The roof was slightly slanted, the wood a faded brown, showing signs of wear from years of exposure to the elements. The windows were small but gave a perfect view of the forest beyond. There was a small porch with a couple of chairs, and the whole place had the charm of something that had been there for decades. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt a sense of calm wash over me. The inside was cozy, dark wooden floors, a fireplace along one wall, a small kitchen area with just the basics, and a couple of old, worn-in armchairs by the window. There was a bed in the corner with a plaid quilt, and the air smelled of wood and dust, the kind of smell you can't find in the city. It was exactly what I wanted, a quiet, simple retreat. After unpacking, I decided to take a walk around the area. The air was crisp, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only thing I could hear. There was a small creek running through the woods nearby, and I followed it for a while, just letting my thoughts drift. The peace was overwhelming in the best way. It felt like I could stay here forever, disconnected from everything, and I found myself wishing I had more time. As evening approached, I made myself some dinner and settled into one of the armchairs, the fireplace crackling softly in front of me. I had brought a book to read, but my eyes kept drifting out the window, drawn to the darkness of the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't completely alone here, that something in the woods was watching. It was a strange feeling, like being observed by something you couldn't see. That night, I went to bed early, my thoughts still occupied with the eerie feeling I had experienced. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and I eventually drifted off to sleep. But something woke me up in the middle of the night. It was the sound of something outside the cabin, scratching. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel. But then I heard it again. The scratching was persistent, rhythmic, like something trying to get in. I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding, listening. The noise continued for a few minutes, then stopped suddenly. I didn't know what to think. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just a branch scraping against the window. But there was something about the way it had stopped so abruptly that made me uneasy. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and walked to the window. The forest outside was dark, almost completely silent now. There was nothing there. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, the unease creeping over me again and again. I convinced myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something was off. The next morning, I tried to shake off the feeling. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a bear maybe, though I hadn't seen any signs of wildlife near the cabin. I went about my day, walking deeper into the woods, taking photos of the scenery, trying to distract myself. That afternoon, I decided to venture out to the creek again. As I walked through the trees, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was not alone. I looked over my shoulder several times, half expecting to see someone standing just out of view. But there was nothing. I reached the creek and sat down by the water, trying to clear my mind. But that's when I saw it. A mark on one of the trees, just across from where I was sitting. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a scratch on the bark. But as I stared at it, I noticed it was too deliberate, too precise. The mark looked like a large X, carved into the tree with some kind of sharp tool. It didn't look natural, like something an animal might do. Someone had made that mark. The chill in the air deepened, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. I turned back toward the cabin and started walking briskly, my steps quickening as I felt the unease grow. The woods seemed darker now, the shadows creeping in between the trees. I couldn't shake the thought that someone or something was following me. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. I made it back to the cabin just as the sun began to set, my thoughts a jumbled mess. I locked the door behind me, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. That night, I stayed inside, not daring to go back out. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked in the gusts. I stayed close to the fireplace, trying to distract myself with a book, but I couldn't focus. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt amplified, like something was about to happen. It was late into the night when I heard it again, the scratching at the window. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper of sound, but it grew louder. I could hear it moving along the window, as if something was circling the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest, and I slowly, quietly, got out of bed. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the window. The light illuminated the trees outside, but there was nothing. Nothing but the thick, oppressive darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept thinking about the mark on the tree, the way the scratching sound seemed to move around the cabin, and the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I knew I had to leave the next morning. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want to be part of it anymore. The next day, I packed up quickly, not bothering to take my time. I didn't even stop to look at the view one last time. I just wanted to get out of there. I got into my car and drove down the long, winding road that had led me to the cabin, my heart still racing. I didn't stop until I was back on the main highway, far from the woods. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw nothing but the endless stretch of road behind me. But the memory of that place, the scratching sound, the marks on the trees, it stayed with me. I don't know what happened out there in those woods, but I can tell you this: I will never go back to that cabin again. Whatever was in those woods, it was better left alone. I don't know if it was a person or something else, but it felt wrong. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the scratching. It had been a long drive. My friend Mike and I had been planning this trip for months, and when the weekend finally arrived, we couldn't wait to get away from the noise and stress of the city. Our destination was a small cabin in the woods, located in a remote area of Vermont. It was the kind of place that promised peace and quiet, far from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. We rented the cabin from an old man named George. He was the kind of person who didn't speak much, and when he did, his words were slow and deliberate. He handed us the keys without much of a smile, just a nod and a warning. The weather here can change fast. Stay close to the cabin if you can. That was all. His cryptic warning stuck with me as we made our way up the narrow, winding road toward the cabin. The air was crisp as we stepped out of the car. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees. It felt good to be away from everything. We unloaded our bags and moved inside. The cabin was small, made of timber, with a stone fireplace in the center of the living room. It was exactly what we needed, a place to relax and disconnect. Mike, always the adventurous one, was the first to suggest we go for a walk. Let's stretch our legs. I want to explore a bit before it gets dark, he said. So we set off into the woods, walking along a narrow path that seemed to disappear into the dense forest. The woods here were thick, the trees towering above us, their branches reaching out like long, gnarled fingers. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural, like the world around you is holding its breath. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, though I couldn't explain why. We walked for about an hour, just talking about nothing in particular. The air was colder now, and the sun had almost disappeared completely. I started to feel uneasy, but Mike was enjoying himself, kicking rocks along the path and making jokes. "We should head back soon," I said, glancing up at the sky. "It's getting late." Mike shrugged. "We'll be fine. Besides, I want to check out that creek we passed earlier." "Come on, just a little farther." Reluctantly, I followed him. It wasn't long before we came to a small creek, its water rushing over smooth rocks. The sound of the water was soothing, but something about the place didn't sit right with me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt off, like we weren't meant to be there. Mike knelt down to dip his hand in the water. "This is nice," he said, staring at the ripples as they moved downstream. "You should try it." I shook my head, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The chill in the air was starting to bite, and I just wanted to head back to the warmth of the cabin. But Mike was still lost in the moment, his attention focused entirely on the water. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound from the woods behind us. It wasn't the wind, this was something different. A movement, something large, breaking through the underbrush. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Mike," I whispered, but he didn't hear me. He was too busy with the creek. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the darkening forest. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches creaking, but the sound was different now. It was deliberate, not the casual rustle of wind, but something moving deliberately through the trees. "Mike!" I called out, my voice louder this time. Mike looked up at me, his face confused. "What is it?" "I heard something," I said, my voice tight with unease. "We need to get back to the cabin. Now." He stood up, brushing his hands on his pants. "You're being paranoid," he said, but his eyes flickered nervously toward the woods. "I don't hear anything." But I did. The sound was getting closer, and now I could see the shadows moving between the trees. They were big, heavy, almost like something walking on two legs. I felt my pulse quicken as the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Without another word, I turned and started walking back toward the cabin. Mike followed, though he was clearly unsure. The air seemed heavier now, as if the weight of the forest itself was pressing in on us. We didn't speak as we hurried back down the path, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there in the dark. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun had completely set, and the world around us was swallowed by darkness. We rushed inside, locking the door behind us. Mike tried to brush it off, but I could tell he was unsettled too. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the fireplace. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods outside seemed to be watching us, waiting. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin seemed amplified in the quiet. Every gust of wind outside felt like footsteps approaching. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the night. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it again. A soft thud, followed by another and then a third. The sound came from the woods, close to the cabin. It was unmistakable now, someone or something was out there. I got up slowly, careful not to wake Mike. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and peered out the window. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, but I saw nothing. The woods were still, too still. I turned the light off and moved to the back door, standing quietly for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Then the noise came again. It was closer this time, and then it stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just silence. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I decided I was just being paranoid. The wind, the trees, they were playing tricks on me. I went back to my room and tried to sleep, but the unease lingered in my chest, a tight knot I couldn't loosen. The next morning, Mike and I decided to leave. The events of the previous night were enough to shake both of us. We packed up our things and left the cabin behind. As we drove away, I glanced back at the small, wooden structure. The woods around it were silent, but for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the only ones who had been there. Looking back, I still don't know what we heard that night. Was it an animal, person, or was it just the mind playing tricks? I guess I'll never know. All I know is that sometimes there are places you don't belong, and there are things out there that you're better off not understanding. The cabin in the woods? I'm glad it's behind me, I just wish I could shake the feeling that something still watches from the shadows, waiting. It was early autumn when I decided to take a break from the busy pace of my life and head out to a secluded cabin I had rented. The world felt heavy on my shoulders, and I was craving some peace and quiet. My friends had warned me against going alone, but I needed the time to think, to clear my head. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from any town or city. The air was crisp, and the leaves were turning shades of gold and red, making the forest look like something from an old painting. I was 29, living in a small town, and had never spent more than a couple of days at a cabin like this before. It was a rustic log cabin, built in the 1800s, with a stone fireplace and a porch that wrapped around the front. The booking description made it sound like a charming place to get away, perfect for a weekend of relaxation. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly what I'd imagined. Isolated, peaceful, and a little weathered. It had an old wooden sign hanging on the front door that simply read "Rustic Retreat," which made me smile. It was all the peace I'd been craving, and I couldn't wait to settle in. The first few hours were exactly what I needed. I made a fire in the fireplace, unpacked my things, and settled into a comfortable chair with a book. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees outside. It was getting colder, but the fire in the cabin was warm, and the crackling of the wood was soothing. As the night drew on, the wind outside picked up. It wasn't a howling wind, but it whistled through the trees, making the branches sway and creak. The sound felt almost alive, like the forest was speaking to itself. I figured it was just the natural noise of the woods, but something about the constant creaking and whispering of the trees started to feel off. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The silence in the cabin was almost overwhelming after the noise of the wind outside. I lay there in the dark, listening to the occasional snap of the wood in the fireplace. At some point, I drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't a peaceful rest. I woke up with a start, my heart racing, to the sound of something tapping against the cabin's window. The wind had picked up again, but this was different. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was knocking or tapping lightly on the glass. I sat up in bed, straining my ears to listen. The rest of the cabin was silent, but the tapping continued. Couldn't ignore it. It was only when I walked over to the window and peered out that I realized the tapping wasn't coming from the wind or branches. There was something or someone out there. I couldn't see anything clearly in the darkness, just the shadowy outlines of the trees, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. The tapping was faint, but it was there, and it was coming from somewhere outside the cabin. My first thought was that maybe it was a small animal like a bird or a raccoon, but then the tapping stopped, and there was a moment of silence. I waited, still not sure if I should open the window and see what was outside. My instincts told me to stay inside, but curiosity won out. I opened the window a crack, just enough to see the porch and the surrounding darkness. Nothing. No creature. No movement. Just the sound of the wind. I closed the window quickly, feeling a little foolish, but a nagging unease remained. I locked the window, turned off the light, and lay back down. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing strange noises, footsteps that didn't seem to belong to the wind or the animals outside, and faint whispers that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I'd read too many scary stories, watched too many movies, but still something felt wrong. The next morning, I woke up early, the sky gray and overcast. The wind had died down, but the air was thick with humidity, and the forest outside looked like a different place under the soft, diffused light. I made coffee, trying to shake off the feeling of unease from the night before. I decided I'd spend the day exploring the woods to take my mind off things. The cabin was built on the edge of a small hiking trail, so I figured I'd follow it for a while. The trail was narrow and wound its way through dense forest. It was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. I tried to relax, telling myself that the eeriness of last night was just in my head. After about an hour of walking, I came across a small clearing. In the center of it was an old, abandoned shed. The roof was caved in, and the wood was weathered and cracked, but there was something about it that piqued my interest. It wasn't marked on any of the maps I had, and I wondered if it had been here for decades, long before the cabin was built. I walked closer, examining the shed. It didn't look like anyone had been around for a long time. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the interior was filled with rotting wood and piles of leaves. But what caught my eye was the small metal box tucked away in the corner. I knelt down to open it, thinking it might be something useful or maybe just a curiosity left behind by whoever had built the shed. But when I opened it, my stomach turned. Inside, there were several old photographs, faded and crinkled with age. They looked like family pictures. People gathered around a table, standing outside by a cabin, smiling. But there was something odd about them. All the faces were scratched out with thick black lines, as though someone wanted to erase their identity completely. I quickly shut the box, my heart racing. I hadn't felt fear like this in a long time. There was something off about this whole situation, something that made me feel like I was trespassing on something I shouldn't be. I left the shed quickly, almost running back toward the cabin. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I made sure to lock the doors and windows before going to bed that night, but the tapping on the window started again, just as it had the night before. This time, though, it wasn't just tapping. It was scratching like claws against the glass. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I knew I had to leave the cabin, but I felt trapped. I was miles away from the nearest town, and the thought of driving through the dark forest alone was terrifying. I tried calling the rental service, but the phone line was dead. No signal whatsoever. The wind howled outside, and the scratching continued, now louder and more frantic. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window. I shone the beam into the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the night, staring at me from the woods. I didn't know what it was, but it was big. Bigger than any animal I had ever seen. The eyes glowed like they were reflecting the light, but they didn't blink, didn't move. I froze, my body trembling with fear, but I couldn't look away. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature disappeared into the woods, leaving me standing there, breathless and wide-eyed. I didn't know what to think, but I knew I couldn't stay there another minute. I grabbed my bag, rushed out of the cabin, and jumped into my car. The tires screeched as I sped down the narrow, winding road, barely able to see in the dim light. The whole time, I felt as though something was right behind me, watching me, chasing me. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the forest and finally saw the lights of the nearest town that I felt the tension in my chest begin to release. I didn't go back to that cabin, and I never spoke to anyone about what had happened. I couldn't explain the eyes, or the tapping, or the strange photographs in the shed. But I knew one thing for sure. Some places are better left undisturbed. I learned that the hard way, and I wouldn't make the same mistake again. It had been a long, stressful year. Work, life, everything felt like it was moving at a pace I couldn't keep up with. I needed to get away. So, when I saw a last-minute offer for a secluded cabin in the mountains of Colorado, I jumped at the chance. I'd always wanted to go camping, but this was something different. This wasn't just a regular camping trip. This was going to be a retreat, a chance to disconnect from the noise, to reset. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and it wasn't exactly easy to get to. The dirt roads seemed to stretch on forever, winding through dense forest, until finally, I reached the place. It looked like something out of an old movie. A small, weathered wooden cabin with a stone chimney, nestled in a small clearing. The kind of place you'd imagine a hermit living in. There was no one around for miles. No neighbors, no other cabins, just the trees and the mountains. I parked the car, grabbed my things, and walked up to the door. The key was under the mat, just like the email had said. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and was immediately hit by the scent of old wood and dust. The place had clearly been empty for a while, but it wasn't in bad shape. The wooden floors creaked under my feet as I set my bags down. The living room was cozy, with a big stone fireplace at one end, a worn-out couch, and a few mismatched chairs. There was a small kitchen area off to the side, complete with a gas stove and an old fridge that hummed quietly. The first thing I did was make a fire. The weather had turned colder since I'd left the city, and I wasn't about to sit in the cabin shivering. I grabbed some logs from the pile outside and got the fire roaring in no time. The warmth spread quickly through the room, and for a moment, everything felt right. It was just me, alone in this quiet cabin, with nothing to worry about except the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound of wind rustling through the trees. I spent the next couple of hours unpacking, settling in, and exploring the cabin. The upstairs loft was small but cozy, with a bed that looked like it had been waiting for someone to curl up in it for years. There was no TV, no internet, no distractions. Just the sound of the wind, the crackling of the fire, and the occasional bird call outside. As the evening wore on, I began to feel the isolation more than I had expected. It wasn't that I was scared, but there was something eerie about being so far from everything. The kind of silence that settled in was thick, almost oppressive. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I made myself some dinner, sat by the fire, and read a book I'd brought with me. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't anything obvious, just a vague sense of unease. The way the trees seemed to sway and groan in the wind outside, the distant howl of some animal I couldn't identify. Even the cabin itself seemed to have a strange energy about it, like it was hiding something. I shook my head. It was just the isolation getting to me. I'd be fine. That night, I slept fitfully. The bed wasn't uncomfortable, but the silence was overwhelming. I woke up several times, disoriented, only to fall back asleep. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps outside, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing but the empty forest. I figured it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I'd been cooped up inside for too long, and I needed some fresh air. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and set off down a narrow trail that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. The air was crisp, and the trees loomed above me, their thick trunks and tangled branches blocking out much of the sunlight. The trail was narrow and uneven, but it was peaceful. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional bird call. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The trail seemed to be getting less and less maintained, like it hadn't been used in years. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the trail was just old. But then I came across something odd. A small, rusted metal object half buried in the dirt. It looked like a piece of an old trap, the kind hunters used back in the day. It sent a chill down my spine, but I shrugged it off. It was probably just left behind by someone a long time ago. I continued walking, pushing the uneasy feeling out of my mind. The forest grew denser, and the trail began to disappear altogether. I thought about turning back, but I was curious. I wasn't about to let some weird feeling stop me. But then, as I rounded a bend, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the middle of the trail, was a cabin. It wasn't large, but it was old. Older than the one I was staying in, with dark, weathered wood and a small porch. I hadn't seen it on the way in. It was almost as if it had appeared out of nowhere. I stood there for a moment, frozen, staring at it. Something about it didn't feel right. It was so out of place, like it had been abandoned for decades. I walked closer, my heart beating faster. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me immediately. It was musty, like mildew and rot. The inside of the cabin was dark and dusty, with old furniture covered in sheets. There were no windows, just small cracks in the walls where the light could barely filter through. But what really struck me was the floor. It was covered in footprints. Big, heavy ones, like someone had been pacing back and forth for hours. The tracks led to a small, dark corner of the room where a rusted, iron stove sat. I didn't want to stick around any longer. I turned and quickly left the cabin, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who had built it? Why had it been abandoned? And why did it feel like someone had been here recently? I hurried back to my cabin, my thoughts swirling. By the time I got back, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the forest. I locked the door behind me and decided not to go outside again. I didn't want to risk running into whoever or whatever had been out there. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the image of the cabin, the footprints, the strange feeling that had crept over me. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, when I heard it, the sound of footsteps, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Someone was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the trees and the swirling mist that had settled in the clearing. But the sound was still there, the faint crunch of footsteps on the ground. I stayed frozen by the window, my pulse racing. The footsteps stopped, and then, after a long moment of silence, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft knock on the door. I couldn't move. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear. The knock came again, louder this time. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number for emergency services, but there was no signal. I cursed under my breath. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to open the door, but I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. I waited, listening for what felt like hours. Finally, the footsteps retreated. The knock stopped. Everything went quiet again. I didn't move from my spot by the window, too afraid to even blink. But after what felt like an eternity, I finally took a breath. Whoever or whatever it was had left. The next morning, I packed up my things. I didn't care about the money I had spent or the isolation. I just wanted to leave. I drove back down the winding road, the mountains looming over me. I never saw anyone on my way out, and as I passed the spot where the trail had branched off, I didn't look back at the cabin in the woods. Some things are better left undisturbed. The drive back to civilization felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I could finally breathe again. As I pulled into a gas station, I saw a man in a jacket, covered in dirt, loading supplies into a truck. He glanced at me as I got out of the car, and I could have sworn he gave me a strange look. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe he knew something I didn't. I didn't ask. I didn't need to know. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had been in those mountains. It was a quiet, cold morning when I arrived at the cabin. The kind of cold that makes the air feel sharp as you breathe it in, biting your skin, even though it's not quite winter yet. I had been driving for hours to get to this secluded spot, and now that I was finally here, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. A break from the noise of the city, a break from everything that was too much for me lately. The cabin stood alone at the edge of a thick forest in the foothills of the Rockies, far from the nearest town. I had rented it online, some last-minute decision to get away and clear my head. The booking was simple enough, and the pictures made the place look rustic, charming, the kind of place that promised peace and solitude. Maybe it was exactly what I needed. When I pulled up, the cabin was just as advertised, though a little more weathered than I expected. Its dark wooden exterior was chipped in places, and there was a faint smell of dampness that clung to the air. Still, it had an inviting feel to it, like a warm hearth waiting inside. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and walked up the creaky steps, the wooden porch groaning under my feet. The key was left for me in the mailbox, just as the owner said it would be. No one around to greet me, no neighbors, no small talk, just me and the cabin. I opened the door and was immediately hit with the smell of wood and earth. The interior was cozy, but not overly fancy. Just simple furniture, a small kitchen, and a wood stove in the corner. I set my bag down and looked around, taking in the wooden beams overhead and the large windows that gave a perfect view of the forest outside. As I explored the cabin, I found it to be functional, if not a little dated. There were no modern luxuries, no Wi-Fi, no flat-screen TV, no distractions. It was just me, the trees, and the silence. I spent the first day settling in, unpacking my things, and getting familiar with the place. The sun dipped below the horizon, and by evening, the chill of the night settled in. The wood stove was doing its job, filling the cabin with warmth, and I settled into a comfy chair by the fire, a book in hand. But as the hours passed, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a slight unease that crept over me as I stared into the dancing flames. Maybe it was the isolation, or the strange way the wind howled through the trees outside, but there was something unsettling about the night. It was too quiet even for the woods. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my nerves, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I tried to ignore it and read my book, but my eyes kept wandering to the windows. I couldn't help but feel like something was watching me from the darkness outside. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just the wind making the trees sway, the way they cast long shadows that seemed to move. I decided to go to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would shake off the strange sensation. But even in the comfort of the bed, tucked in under the thick blankets, I couldn't relax. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race a little faster. The wind was still howling outside, and I could hear the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. I eventually managed to drift off to sleep, but it wasn't the restful kind. The dreams were fragmented, disjointed, a mixture of memories and strange images. I woke up several times during the night, my heart pounding in my chest for no apparent reason. The next day, I woke up feeling drained, not quite rested. I tried to shake it off, thinking that maybe the stress of the drive and the unfamiliar environment was just taking a toll on me. I made some coffee, hoping it would give me a boost, and stepped outside to get some fresh air. The cold hit me immediately, the kind that nipped at your nose and made you regret not bringing a scarf. The sun was up, but it didn't seem to do much to warm the air. The forest around the cabin was thick, the trees tall and imposing. A narrow trail wound through the woods, leading deeper into the forest. I figured I'd take a short hike, stretch my legs, and maybe clear my mind. But as I walked along the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was no one there, just trees, branches swaying in the wind, and the endless rustling of leaves. I pressed on, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I reached a small clearing where the trail seemed to end and stopped to take in the view. The silence was overwhelming. It felt like the entire world had been swallowed up by the forest, leaving only me in this tiny, remote spot. That's when I heard it, a faint noise, like a twig snapping in the distance. It was barely audible, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I spun around, expecting to see someone or something, but the forest was as still as ever. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a squirrel, maybe, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I made my way back to the cabin quickly, my steps quickening as I neared the door. I didn't want to admit it, but something about the forest and this place was starting to make me uneasy. That night, the feeling only intensified. I couldn't shake the sense that there was someone else here, even though I knew there couldn't be. The owner had told me the cabin was completely isolated. Still, every noise outside seemed to be amplified in the silence. The wind rustled the trees, and the occasional thud of a falling branch made me jump. I stayed inside, the warmth of the fire offering only a temporary comfort. I tried to stay busy, but my mind kept racing. I thought about leaving, about packing up and driving back to the city, but I was too stubborn to let fear get the best of me. Besides, I told myself it's just a feeling. It would pass. But the next morning, when I opened the door, I found something strange. A set of footprints in the snow leading up to the porch. They were fresh, the snow still slightly disturbed, as if someone had just walked up to the cabin. My heart stopped. I wasn't sure what to make of it. There was no way anyone could have been there without me noticing. I hadn't heard a car, hadn't seen anyone around. I glanced around the cabin, my eyes scanning the trees, but there was nothing. I followed the tracks, which led me to the edge of the forest. But then, something strange caught my eye. A piece of cloth caught on a bush, torn and frayed, as if someone had been in a hurry. I reached out, my fingers brushing the fabric, and a chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, I heard something, a movement in the trees. Quick, too quick for a normal animal. My pulse raced, my thoughts scattered. I turned and ran back to the cabin, the door slamming shut behind me as I locked it. The rest of the day was a blur. I didn't leave the cabin again. I kept the curtains drawn, the lights on, and the wood stove burning as if trying to ward off the cold that was creeping in. But it wasn't just the cold from outside that made me feel uneasy. It was the fear that someone or something was watching me. By the time night fell again, I had made my decision. I would leave in the morning. It wasn't worth the fear, the unease. But just as I was about to go to bed, I heard a knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but then louder, more insistent. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no way anyone should be here. The knock came again, louder this time. With shaking hands, I grabbed the nearest thing to me, an old fireplace poker, and approached the door. I didn't open it. I just stood there, waiting, listening. The knocking stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but there was nothing. I couldn't hear anyone breathing. No rustling, no footsteps, just the wind. Eventually, I gathered the courage to peek through the window beside the door. The porch was empty. No one was there. I didn't know if I was relieved or more scared than ever. The night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, I left. I packed up my things, checked the cabin one last time, and got into my car. As I drove down the narrow road, I glanced back at the cabin in my rearview mirror. It looked so peaceful, so innocent, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something or someone was out there, watching. I never came back. I hadn't planned on going to Pine Ridge Cabin. In fact, the whole idea had been my brother Adam's. He'd always been the adventurous one, the kind of guy who'd throw himself into any situation, no matter how risky. I was more cautious, preferring the quiet of my apartment in the city over long trips into the wilderness. But when he convinced me to join him for a weekend in the mountains, I thought it might be a good change of pace. The cabin was located about 5 hours north of where we lived, nestled in a valley surrounded by thick pine trees. The area had a reputation for being remote, with little to no phone signal. Perfect, Adam had said. The kind of place where you could disconnect and get back to basics. The weather had been perfect when we first arrived. A warm late summer afternoon with a light breeze rustling the leaves of the trees. Pine Ridge was one of those places you'd never find unless you were looking for it. No fancy road signs or tourist attractions, just miles of winding dirt roads leading deeper into the forest. The cabin itself was an old wooden structure, maybe a century old, with creaky floors and faded walls that looked like they'd seen better days. Still, it had a charm to it, and Adam insisted it was the perfect spot to get away from the stresses of everyday life. We arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The shadows in the woods grew long, and the quiet of the place settled over us like a heavy blanket. Adam unloaded the gear from the truck, while I took a moment to appreciate the peace. There were no sounds of traffic or people talking, just the chirping of crickets and the wind through the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As the evening wore on, we set up a small campfire outside the cabin. The fire crackled and popped as we sat around it, each of us with a cold beer in hand. The stars were out, and the sky looked like something you'd only see in pictures. Clear, endless, and full of distant lights. For a while, everything felt perfect. The day's fatigue began to fade, and I started to relax. But as the fire burned low, I started to notice something strange. A feeling of being watched, just on the edge of my awareness. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just outside the circle of light cast by the fire. But each time I turned, nothing was there. "Did you hear that?" I asked Adam, trying to shake the feeling. "Hear what?" He glanced up from his beer, eyes squinting into the darkness. "It's probably just some wildlife. We're deep in the woods, man." I nodded but couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Maybe it was just the unfamiliar setting, the silence, or the fact that I hadn't spent much time in nature like this. We stayed outside for a while longer, talking about nothing in particular, but I couldn't help but notice how quickly the night seemed to fall. The chill in the air was creeping in, and the fire's warmth didn't seem to reach as far as it had before. We eventually decided to head inside, both of us a little on edge. Inside, the cabin was colder than I expected. I was relieved to find a wood stove in the corner of the main room, and we quickly got it going, the flames casting flickering shadows across the old walls. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wood stove heated up, and the wind howled outside, causing the trees to sway and rustle. We were both exhausted from the long drive and the day's activities, so after some quick dinner preparations, we turned in for the night. Adam took the room on the left, while I took the one on the right. There was no lock on the door, just a simple latch, but I wasn't worried. It felt like the kind of place where you could leave your door open and not think twice about it. But as I lay in bed, drifting off to sleep, I kept hearing things. Soft thumps, like footsteps on the porch, or maybe the creaking of the wooden frame. At first, I told myself it was the house settling, the wind pushing against the walls. But then the sounds became more deliberate, like someone was walking around outside, pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something human. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from outside. I shot up in bed, heart racing. It sounded like something had hit the side of the cabin. I lay there, frozen, listening for any further sounds, but everything was quiet again. I waited for what felt like an eternity, then slowly got up and moved to the window. The glass was fogged up, and I couldn't see much, but I thought I saw a figure moving in the shadows just outside. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "It's just the wind," I whispered to myself, but even as I said it, I wasn't convinced. I lay back down, keeping the blanket pulled up around me. The air in the room felt colder now, and I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. I held my breath, hoping it was just my imagination. But then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floor of the cabin. My heart slammed against my chest as I sat up again, wide awake. I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, but it felt like it was just outside my room. The silence stretched on, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I didn't want to know what was making those noises. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Complete silence. I couldn't sleep after that. Every little creak, every shift of the wind, every groan of the wood felt like it was amplified. I spent the rest of the night lying there, wide-eyed, listening for anything that might happen next. I had always loved the idea of getting away from the city, away from the noise, the constant buzz of people, and the suffocating feeling that came with always being surrounded by crowds. A cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect escape, and when I came across a rental listing for a small, isolated cabin in the hills of northern Vermont, I jumped at the chance. The ad described it as the ideal getaway for someone looking to relax, disconnect, and immerse themselves in nature. It sounded perfect. It wasn't a luxurious place, but that was exactly what I wanted. A simple, rustic cabin where I could spend a few days unwinding and thinking things through. I was 32, recently separated, and still adjusting to the solitude. The past few months had been a blur of work and attempts to patch up a relationship that had been on the rocks for far too long. Now I needed a break. I booked the cabin for a long weekend and packed my things. Clothes, food, a couple of books, and of course my camera. I'd be alone, but that was the point. I didn't need company. I needed space to clear my head. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected, but the scenery along the way was breathtaking. Rolling hills, dense forests, and winding dirt roads led me further into the mountains. I turned off the main road onto a narrow path that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me. The trees thickened, their shadows growing longer as the day slipped into evening. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had already begun its descent, casting an orange glow across the landscape. The cabin itself was exactly what I had imagined. Small, weathered, and nestled at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees. There was a creaky porch with a few chairs, a stone fireplace in the living room, and a kitchen that seemed functional enough. It looked like it had been built decades ago, and the air smelled of old wood and pine. Perfect. Exactly what I needed. I unpacked my things and set up for the evening. The night fell quickly, and I made myself a simple dinner. Afterward, I sat on the porch for a while, watching the stars. There was no light pollution out here, and the sky was so clear it felt like I could reach out and touch the stars. The silence was overwhelming, but in a good way. It was peaceful, calming, almost like the world had stopped for a moment. But as the night wore on, a feeling began to creep up on me. It was subtle at first, just an odd sense of being watched, a prickle at the back of my neck that wouldn't go away. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I hadn't been alone in a long time, and I was probably just adjusting to the stillness. I went inside and locked the door behind me. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees, and I settled in front of the fireplace with a book. The crackling of the fire was soothing, and I soon lost myself in the pages. But then I heard something, a sound, faint but distinct. It was a thud, like something heavy had dropped to the ground. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I listened for a moment, but the sound didn't come again. I chalked it up to the wind or an animal outside. I tried to get back to my book, but I couldn't shake the unease. Every time I turned the page, I felt my eyes drifting toward the window. The trees outside were moving violently in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning under the pressure. I knew I was just being paranoid, but something about the atmosphere made me uneasy. It was too quiet, except for the wind. There was nothing. No rustling of animals, no distant sound of cars. Just the wind. I eventually gave up on reading and decided to go to bed. I turned off the lights, crawled into the thick blankets, and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing things. The creak of the cabin settling, the faint sound of footsteps outside. It wasn't uncommon for a cabin to make noises in the night, but the sounds seemed more deliberate, more methodical. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The next morning, I woke up to a quiet, overcast sky. The air outside was damp, and the ground was covered in a light mist. I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would help clear my head. I grabbed my camera and headed out the door, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. The woods were peaceful, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the forest floor and the occasional bird call. For a while, I felt normal again. I wandered deeper into the woods, snapping photos of the landscape. The fog made everything look otherworldly, as if the world had been frozen in time. I lost track of time, eventually realizing that I had strayed much farther from the cabin than I intended. When I turned to head back, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the mud, fresh, deep impressions, as if someone had walked through here recently. They weren't animal tracks, they were human. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the footprints. I was alone out here. I was sure of it. No one else had rented this cabin. I followed the tracks for a while, my curiosity getting the better of me. The footprints led me off the path and into a dense part of the woods, where the trees were thick and the underbrush was tangled. As I pushed through the branches, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. Something wasn't right. I felt like I was being drawn into something I shouldn't be a part of. Eventually, I reached a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. A structure, dilapidated and half hidden by the trees. It was an old shed, or maybe a barn, with broken windows and a roof that was caving in. The door was ajar, and I could see something inside, a dark shape. I approached cautiously, but my instincts screamed at me to turn around, to get back to the safety of the cabin. I ignored them. I had to know what was inside. I pushed open the door, and the smell hit me first. Stale air, decay, and something else, something sharp and metallic. I hesitated, then stepped inside. The floor creaked under my weight, and I shined my camera's flashlight around. There was nothing unusual at first, just old wooden beams, a few crates, and some broken furniture. But then I saw it, a patch of red on the floor. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. Blood. My stomach dropped. I backed away slowly, suddenly feeling very exposed, like someone had been watching me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in quick gasps. I didn't stop until I was back at the cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking. I spent the rest of the day in the cabin, too scared to go outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was out there, someone who didn't want me here. I spent hours pacing the cabin, my mind racing. Was it just my imagination? Had I really seen blood? The whole thing felt unreal. By the time night fell, I had convinced myself it was just nerves. Maybe the blood was animal blood. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But the sounds didn't stop. There were footsteps outside, faint but unmistakable. I could hear them on the porch, then the sound of something dragging along the ground. The wind howled louder than before, and the trees outside seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching toward the cabin like fingers. The rest of the night was a blur. I don't remember when I fell asleep, but I woke up in the morning with the sun shining brightly through the windows. The world outside seemed peaceful, like nothing had happened the night before. I didn't know if I had dreamed it all or if something had really been out there, but I was done. I packed my things quickly, leaving behind the food and the firewood. I wasn't staying another minute. I didn't look back as I drove down the dirt road, the cabin disappearing behind the trees. As I hit the main road and headed toward civilization, I felt a wave of relief. I didn't know who or what had been in the woods with me that weekend, but I never wanted to find out again. It had been too real, too unsettling. When I returned home, I tried to forget it. I tried to convince myself it had just been my imagination playing tricks on me, that I had overreacted. But the memories wouldn't fade. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear those footsteps, that dragging sound, and I wondered if someone had been watching me the entire time. It's been years now, and I still haven't gone back to that cabin. I'm not sure if I ever will, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods or in a quiet place, I get the sense that something's watching me, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was that weekend, whatever it was that followed me in the woods, is still out there. I've always loved the idea of getting away from it all. After weeks of constant emails and deadlines, the thought of being alone in nature with no distractions seemed like the perfect escape. So, I rented a small, isolated cabin in the woods just outside of a little town called Pineview. It was supposed to be a weekend retreat, a chance to relax, clear my head, and recharge. I didn't expect things to take the turn they did. It was mid-September, the weather still warm enough for hiking, but the coolness of fall starting to creep in. The cabin itself was rustic, built in the 1950s, with wood floors that creaked underfoot and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in ages. A small porch wrapped around the front, with a rocking chair in the corner. The view from the porch was incredible. Tall pines as far as the eye could see, a narrow dirt road leading into the trees, and a quiet creek flowing nearby. I had rented the cabin for 3 days, planning on doing a bit of hiking, reading, and just unwinding. I didn't expect much, just some solitude, some quiet. The first few hours were perfect. I unpacked my gear, made myself a sandwich, and sat on the porch, watching the sun filter through the trees. The sound of birds chirping and the rustle of leaves in the breeze made everything feel calm. But the peacefulness didn't last. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I went to light the fireplace, only to find that there was no firewood in the cabin. I sighed, grabbing my jacket and heading out to the woods behind the cabin to gather some. The woods weren't far, just a short walk from the back door, but as I stepped out into the cool air, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I shook it off. It was probably just the isolation, the quiet, but something felt off. The trees were denser here, the canopy thick enough to block out most of the fading light. It made everything feel more enclosed, more suffocating. As I gathered firewood, I noticed something strange. There was a small, rusted tin can half buried in the dirt. I bent down to examine it, But before I could even touch it, a sharp crack of a twig sounded behind me. I froze. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. No one should be out here. I was the only one for miles. I turned quickly, scanning the woods, but there was nothing. Just the trees and the growing shadows. Just my mind playing tricks. I muttered to myself, grabbing the firewood and heading back to the cabin. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The sound of the crackling fire filled the cabin, but outside, the silence was oppressive. Not a single sound from the animals or the wind. It was as if the forest had gone still. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang, something heavy striking the side of the cabin. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed a flashlight from the table and made my way to the door. The air outside was crisp, and the only light came from the sliver of moon peeking through the trees. I swept the flashlight's beam over the yard, but I saw nothing. The cabin was surrounded by nothing but trees and the soft, swaying grass. I thought maybe it was an animal, perhaps a raccoon or a bear knocking into the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The quiet was too absolute. I checked the windows, all secure. The door was locked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just outside my line of sight. I spent the next few hours pacing around the cabin, double-checking every lock, every corner, before I finally convinced myself to go back to bed. The next morning, I woke up late, the sunlight streaming through the window. The calm from the day before had returned, and I thought maybe I was just imagining things. It was just the isolation, I told myself again. I was in a cabin in the woods alone. It was natural to feel a little nervous. I spent the day hiking, trying to clear my mind. The path was rougher than I expected, winding through dense underbrush and uneven ground. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and though I tried to ignore the unease gnawing at me, it was impossible to dismiss the sense of something being wrong. I kept checking behind me, even though I knew there was no one around. By the time I made it back to the cabin that afternoon, I was exhausted. I was sweaty and sore, my muscles aching from the uneven terrain. I didn't know what had come over me, but I felt a deep, creeping sense of dread, like I wasn't alone. I checked the cabin again, peeking out the windows, locking doors, and making sure nothing seemed disturbed. That night, as I tried to relax by the fire, I heard it again, a thudding sound, like something heavy hitting the cabin's walls. This time I couldn't ignore it. I stood up, grabbed the flashlight, and went outside, heart pounding in my chest. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches, but otherwise, the area was eerily still. I swept the beam across the yard, the flashlight flickering slightly in my trembling hand. Nothing. No one. I was just about to go back inside when I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the shadows. A man, tall, with a hooded jacket, his face obscured by the darkness. I froze. My mind raced. Was it a hiker? Someone lost in the woods? But as I stared at him, I realized something terrifying. He wasn't moving. He wasn't doing anything at all. Just standing there, watching. I took a step back, my breath shallow, the flashlight now aimed directly at him. But the figure didn't react. He just stood there, unmoving. After what felt like an eternity, I turned and rushed back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and bolted the windows, my heart thumping in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside made me jump, every crack of wood, every gust of wind. I didn't dare leave the cabin again. The next morning, I woke up to find that my worst fear had come true. The footprints, in the dirt just outside the cabin, were the unmistakable prints of boots, large, heavy ones. They were fresh, and they led directly to the cabin's door. The man from last night had been there. I was terrified, but I knew I couldn't just sit there and wait for him to come back. So, I packed up my things, threw my gear into the car, and left. I didn't stop driving until I reached Pineview, where I found a small diner and asked if anyone knew about the cabin. The waitress was kind enough to point me in the direction of the rental office. When I got there, I was still shaken, but I couldn't help but feel some relief. The man hadn't followed me, or at least not that I knew of. I handed the keys back, and the woman at the desk asked how my stay was. I told her about the figure in the woods, the banging on the cabin, and the footprints. She gave me a long look, then nodded. "Yeah, I've heard stories about that cabin," she said quietly. "You're not the first to feel like someone's watching. The previous owners, they just up and left, no explanation. The cabin had been sitting empty for months before they'd rented it out to me. I never did find out who had been out there in the woods, or why they were watching me. But as I left Pineview and drove back to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something I couldn't understand. But I was safe, and that was all that mattered." It was the kind of thing I had dreamed about for years. A quiet weekend away from everything. No emails, no calls, just me and the woods. I'd been thinking about it for months, finally finding the right cabin to rent. It was tucked away in the backwoods of Vermont, far from the nearest town. The pictures on the listing had looked perfect, like something out of a nature magazine. Wooden, rustic, and cozy, with a stone fireplace and a wide, open porch that seemed to look out onto nothing but trees. I was 32 years old, still trying to find a way to disconnect from the constant buzz of my life. I'd been working a corporate job for nearly a decade, and even though the pay was good, I found myself exhausted all the time. The city had become suffocating. So, when I saw the listing for the cabin, I jumped on it immediately. I drove up on a Friday afternoon. The car ride had been long, but the change in scenery was a welcome sight. The trees began to get taller, the roads narrower, and the air fresher as I got closer. I checked my phone, no signal. Perfect. I didn't want any distractions. When I finally arrived, it was around 5 p.m. The sun was just starting to dip, casting long shadows across the front of the cabin. The place was even more beautiful in person. The walls were made of thick logs, and the porch wrapped around the whole cabin. There was a little stone path leading down to a small pond in the back, surrounded by tall pines. I could feel the weight of the city life slowly lifting off my shoulders as I unloaded my things from the car. I was eager to relax, to just breathe in the fresh air and listen to the wind in the trees. Felt like a dream. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I needed. A large stone fireplace took up most of one wall, and the smell of old wood and pine filled the air. The furniture was comfortable, the kind you could just sink into after a long day. The kitchen had all the essentials, no fancy appliances, just a stove, a fridge, and a table for two. It was small but cozy, perfect for a solo retreat. After I unpacked, I made a simple dinner, a can of soup and some crackers. There wasn't much else to do, so I sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth. The sound of the crackling logs filled the room, and for a moment, it felt like everything was right. This was exactly what I had been looking for. By the time the sun had fully set, the darkness in the woods was absolute. The only light came from the cabin's windows and the faint glow of the stars. I stepped outside for a moment, the air crisp and cool. The silence was almost deafening. No cars, no people, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. It felt almost unnatural, how quiet it was, but in a good way. I sat on the porch for a while, just soaking it all in. The fireflies were just beginning to light up the yard, and I could hear the occasional rustle of something in the bushes. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon, but nothing that really worried me. After a while, I went back inside and locked the door behind me. It felt like the kind of place you didn't have to worry about locking up. No one could be around for miles, but it was still a habit I couldn't shake. It was nearly 9 p.m., and the world outside had completely fallen into silence again. I settled in for the night, pulling the blanket around me and lying on the couch. The fire had burned down to embers, but I didn't mind. The warmth was enough to keep me comfortable. Around midnight, I woke up. I'm not sure why, but I felt uneasy. My heart was racing slightly, like I had been startled awake by something. The cabin was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the dying fire. I listened carefully, but all I could hear was the wind outside. But then I heard it, a noise from outside. It was faint, like something dragging across the ground. I tried to dismiss it. Could be an animal, maybe a fallen branch, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It seemed to move slowly, back and forth. My first thought was that someone was outside, maybe a hiker or a local. But that didn't make sense. There was no road nearby, no path that led close to the cabin. It was isolated. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound continued, growing louder now, and I realized it was coming from the other side of the cabin, the back. My heart started to race as I grabbed my flashlight. I didn't know what to do, whether I should check it out or just stay inside, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't about to let whatever it was get any closer to me. I crept to the back door, flashlight in hand. I peeked out through the small window, my breath fogging up the glass. The backyard was dark, only illuminated by the faint light from the cabin. There was nothing there. No person, no animal, nothing. But the sound persisted. It was close now, right on the edge of the porch, scraping against the wood. My mind raced. I felt a sharp chill run through my spine. The only thing I could think of was someone, maybe a local, trying to mess with me, play some kind of prank. But why would they do it now, in the middle of nowhere, at such a late hour? I opened the door carefully, staying just inside the threshold, and shone the flashlight around. The beam danced across the porch, illuminating only the shadows of trees and the outlines of old wooden beams. There was nothing on the porch, nothing in sight. But then I saw it, the scrape. It was coming from under the cabin. I hadn't noticed it before, but the space underneath the building was large enough to fit something, a person or an animal. Without thinking, I stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. I flashed the light under the cabin. Nothing. I crouched down, shining the beam into the darkness. There was a brief, sickening moment of silence, and then scrape. I froze. It wasn't a person. It was a tool, a long metal instrument dragging itself across the ground. My mind raced. I backed up, nearly tripping over the steps, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound was still there, rhythmic, slow, as if whatever it was beneath the cabin knew I was listening. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran back inside, locked the door behind me, and grabbed my phone. There was no signal, of course, but the idea of contacting someone, even if it was just a local ranger, sounded like the right thing to do. I tried calling anyway. No luck. The scraping stopped for a few minutes, but my nerves were shot. I didn't know if I could stay there another second. What if it wasn't a person? What if it was something worse? I stayed awake, sitting on the couch, gripping the flashlight, staring at the door. Time crawled by, but the noises didn't return. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just an animal, a raccoon or something else, moving around under the porch. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The cabin was meant to be a retreat, a place to escape, to disconnect from the world, and just breathe in the peace of the mountains. It was secluded, hidden deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. I thought I could spend a weekend there by myself, enjoying the quiet, focusing on my work, and resetting my mind. But what I didn't expect was that the cabin, despite being in the middle of nowhere, was anything but peaceful. I remember driving up there. The road was a narrow, winding path that barely fit my truck. The forest around me seemed endless, the trees towering like dark sentinels. As I drove deeper into the woods, the air became thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, a sharp contrast to the fresh mountain air I'd imagined. There were no signs of other people. The few houses I passed were abandoned, with their windows broken and doors hanging off their hinges. It felt like something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The cabin itself was rustic, built from dark, weathered wood, the kind that looked like it had been standing there for decades. The windows were large, allowing the sunlight to flood the interior, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Still, I told myself it was nothing, just my overactive imagination. I was used to being alone, especially out in the woods, but this time felt different. I unloaded my gear, unpacked my things, and made myself comfortable inside. The cabin was simple. A fireplace, a small kitchen, a couple of armchairs, and a bed tucked in the corner. There was a heavy silence in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards under my feet. The first night, I made a fire, settled into the chair, and read for a while. The shadows outside lengthened as the night drew on, and the wind started picking up, howling through the trees. Around midnight, I heard something, a rustling sound coming from the woods. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just an animal, but then I heard it again, a low thud, followed by a scrape, almost like something, or someone, was moving around just outside the cabin. My heart raced as I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing, just the wind pushing the branches around. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a bear, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I went to bed that night with the uneasy thought that something was wrong. I didn't sleep well, tossing and turning under the thick blanket. Every little noise outside made me freeze, straining my ears to catch the faintest sound. At one point, I heard something scrape against the wall of the cabin, just beneath my window. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and went to the door, but again, there was nothing. No sign of anything unusual. The next day, I decided to take a walk around the area. The cabin was isolated, with no other houses nearby, just a stretch of wilderness that seemed endless. I wandered down a trail that led into the woods, my boots crunching on the dry leaves beneath me. The trees here were thick, their branches interlocking above, creating a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. It felt like being inside a tunnel of nature, with no way out. As I walked, I came across an old, rusted truck hidden among the trees. It was strange, out of place. It hadn't been used in years. I walked up to it, inspecting it from all sides, but there was no sign of who it belonged to or why it had been abandoned there. A chill ran down my spine as I thought about how far off the road this truck had to be. It was as if whoever owned it had intentionally hidden it in the woods. I quickly turned and headed back to the cabin, the feeling of unease growing with every step. When I returned, I locked the door behind me and sat down at the table. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. It was the little things, the faint sound of footsteps in the woods, the whisper of the wind, the way the trees seemed to move just a bit too much. That evening, I decided to try and ignore it. I made dinner, sat by the fire, and watched the flames dance. I reminded myself that I was being paranoid. There was no reason to feel this way, but as the night crept on, the feeling didn't subside. Instead, it intensified, and then it happened again. The scraping sound. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Something was moving outside, slowly, methodically. I got up, flashlight in hand, and made my way to the door once more. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened the door just a crack, my heart thumping in my chest. I scanned the darkness, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night. And there, in the distance, I saw something that made my stomach drop. An old man, hunched over, standing just at the edge of the tree line. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the cabin. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing, but I knew one thing for sure: he didn't belong there. The man wasn't a local. There were no other houses nearby. He had no reason to be out here. I slammed the door shut, bolted it, and backed away from the window. I didn't know what to do. It was late, and I was miles away from the nearest neighbor or town. I spent the next hour sitting in the dark, staring at the walls, waiting for any sign of movement. But nothing happened. No sounds, no knocks, just silence. Morning came, and I couldn't shake the image of the old man from my mind. I decided to pack up and leave. I wasn't going to stay another night there, not with whatever that was lurking outside. But when I went to leave, the truck wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and coughed, but wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood and tried to check it out, but there was nothing obvious wrong. I didn't know what to do. I was stuck. Hours passed, and I tried everything I could think of to get the truck running. Nothing worked. I had no cell service, no way of contacting anyone. It was just me, in that cabin, with something I couldn't explain lurking in the woods. As the day turned to night, I sat by the fire, not bothering to eat. Couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. The air outside had turned cold, and I could hear the wind picking up again. The trees rustled, creaking under the pressure. And then I heard something else. Footsteps, slowly making their way across the porch. They stopped just outside the door. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind raced. Who was out there? What did they want? The minutes dragged on, stretching into what felt like hours. And then the footsteps faded away, back into the night. I waited and waited. Nothing. No sound. No movement. The next morning, I woke up to an eerie silence. I went outside, unsure of what I was expecting. The woods were still unnaturally so. There was no sign of the old man, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. The truck was still dead, but there was something different about the air. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I spent the day checking the truck again, but it was clear I wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. I had to wait until help arrived. I settled in for another night, but this time I wasn't so afraid. I had survived, and I knew I could make it through until I could get out of there. The old man never came back. When I finally got the truck running, it was as if the forest had released its grip on me. I drove out of those woods and never looked back, but I couldn't forget the feeling that something had been watching me the whole time. A feeling that, no matter how far I drove, I could never truly escape. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon when I finally found the old cabin. I had been hiking for hours, lost in the forest, and the chill of the evening air settled in like a thick blanket. My name is Kyle, and I'm no stranger to the outdoors. Growing up in Vermont, hiking and camping were as natural to me as breathing. But this was different. Something felt off about this trip from the start. I had planned a solo weekend getaway, seeking solace and some time away from the noise of city life. The plan was simple: hike, camp, and disconnect. I had mapped out a trail I had heard about from a local park ranger. It promised scenic views and a chance to escape into the wild. I wasn't expecting much, just some quiet time alone with my thoughts. But here I was, hours away from where I thought I should be, standing in front of an old, weathered cabin. The wood looked like it had been standing for decades, if not longer. It was covered in moss and had an almost unnatural quiet about it. No wind rustled the trees, no animals scurried about. Just silence. I had been walking along the trail, and I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. The map I was using had an old print, and I didn't want to rely too heavily on the GPS on my phone, afraid it might drain the battery too quickly. The cabin wasn't marked on the map, and that was enough to make me hesitate. I stood there for a moment, thinking about turning back, but it had started to rain lightly, and the night was closing in fast. The thought of continuing through the woods in the dark didn't sit well with me. So, with a resigned sigh, I walked up to the front door of the cabin and knocked twice, even though I knew no one would answer. There was no harm in taking shelter for the night. The door creaked open when I tried the handle. Inside, the dim light of dusk filtered through the small, cracked windows. The air smelled old, stale, and musty, but not unpleasant. I stepped inside, setting my backpack down on the rough wooden floor. The space was empty, save for the remnants of an old life. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and a rusted iron stove sat cold against the far wall. I didn't feel scared at first. It was just an old cabin, abandoned, likely forgotten by everyone. But as I set up my sleeping bag on the floor, something nagged at me. The longer I stood there, the more I felt as though I wasn't alone. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I'd been hiking for hours and the isolation was starting to get to me. I lit a small campfire outside in the stone pit to keep the chill at bay, hoping it would help settle my nerves. But when I returned to the cabin, it felt colder than it should have, and the silence grew heavier. That's when I noticed something strange. In the corner of the room, near the back door, was a small table with an old, leather-bound journal on it. It wasn't something I would have missed if I had noticed it earlier. The book had been left open, as though someone had been writing in it recently. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up and scanned the pages. The handwriting was shaky. The ink faded in some parts. It was hard to make sense of most of it, but a few words stuck out. Not alone. And they watch. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was just some ramblings. I told myself, maybe the last person who lived here had been going through a tough time. But still, something about it didn't sit right. I quickly put the journal back where I found it, trying to shake off the unease that was slowly creeping up on me. The night went on, and I tried to keep myself busy by making dinner. But the quiet was overwhelming. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind outside felt like it was louder than it should be. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, watching me. But no one was there. By the time I finished eating, the fire outside had burned down to nothing but glowing embers. I decided to get some sleep, but I found myself lying awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. Every noise, every shift of the house, seemed magnified in the stillness of the night. And then I heard something, a faint sound, like a whisper, drifting through the air. It was so soft at first I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, a rustle, followed by a low murmur that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. My heart rate quickened. I got up, grabbing the flashlight from my pack, and slowly made my way to the back door. The beam of light cut through the dark, revealing the overgrown yard and trees swaying in the wind. There was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every sound. The sun eventually began to rise, casting an orange light through the dirty windows. The cold still lingered in the air, but I knew I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to leave, but as I was heading out the door, something caught my eye. In the dirt near the cabin's porch was a fresh set of footprints. They were large, deep impressions, like someone had been standing there recently. I froze. The tracks didn't look old, maybe just a day or two, and they weren't mine. I hurried out of the cabin, the hairs on my neck standing straight up. I didn't dare look back. My feet carried me faster than I'd ever walked before, as if the woods themselves were closing in around me. I made my way back to the trail, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there, that someone or something was following me. When I finally made it to the trailhead, I didn't stop to rest. I just kept walking, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town and found a small diner that I finally let my guard down. The waitress was friendly, offering me a cup of coffee and asking where I had been. I didn't want to tell her about the cabin. I didn't want to tell anyone. But when I finally asked about the area, she paused, giving me a strange look. "That old cabin out there? You didn't go inside, did you?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I did." "Why?" She shook her head. "It's been abandoned for years. No one's lived there in a long time. People around here say it's best to stay away from that place. Some folks claim they've seen things, strange things, in the woods near it." I swallowed hard, trying to hide my unease. "What kind of things?" She gave me a sympathetic look. "People say they've heard voices. Some claim they've seen figures moving in the trees at night. But it's just talk, you know? People get lost out there, get a little scared, start making up stories. But if I were you, I wouldn't go back." I didn't tell her I had already been there. I didn't want to hear any more. Later, when I left the diner, I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. But nothing was there. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Something in that place felt wrong. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe it was the unsettling quiet, or maybe it was something I'll never fully understand. But I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in that old, abandoned cabin, and I'll never forget the footprints in the dirt. The woods have a way of hiding their secrets, and I'm not sure if I want to know what's lurking just beyond the trees. But I do know one thing for certain. I wasn't alone that night, not by a long shot. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I decided to take a short break from the constant buzz of city life. The mountains have always been my place of refuge, and I figured a weekend in a remote cabin would give me the solitude I needed. No one would be around for miles, which was exactly what I wanted. The cabin was located in a dense forest, a few hours from the nearest town, which made it even more appealing. I needed to disconnect, clear my mind, and recharge. The drive up to the cabin was peaceful. The winding roads cut through towering trees, their leaves painted in shades of orange, yellow, and red. The air felt fresh, and the world seemed quieter the further I went. I had rented the cabin from a local, a grizzled man who warned me about the potential dangers of the area, though he didn't seem particularly concerned. He mentioned something about wild animals being more active this time of year, but brushed it off as nothing serious. As far as I was concerned, I was just there for the quiet, the solitude, and the beauty of nature. When I finally arrived, I took in the sight of the cabin nestled between two massive pines. It wasn't much, just a simple, wooden structure with a porch and a steep roof that looked like it had been there for decades. Still, there was something charming about it. A small, rusted mailbox sat at the foot of a dirt path, and the front door had a squeaky hinge. I grabbed my backpack from the car and walked up to the porch, the old boards creaking beneath my boots. Inside, the cabin smelled like pine and old wood. It was cozy, though a little worn, with a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The furniture was simple: an old couch, a couple of chairs, and a kitchen table covered with a faded tablecloth. I set my things down, explored the small space, and decided I'd start a fire to warm up the place. It was early evening, and the sun was already dipping below the trees, casting long shadows through the windows. As I got the fire going, the warm glow of the flames illuminated the cabin, and I felt a strange sense of peace. The outside world seemed so far away, and I was alone with my thoughts. I was used to solitude, but there was something different about this place. The stillness was almost too perfect, too quiet. The sound of the crackling fire was the only thing breaking the silence, and it made me feel small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things. I spent the evening reading a book I'd brought along and occasionally glanced out the window, admiring the deepening darkness of the forest. The stars began to appear, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen the night sky so clear. But as I sat there, I began to notice something odd. The trees outside were swaying gently, but there wasn't a breeze. The stillness of the air was unsettling, and every now and then, I could swear I saw something moving just outside the window. At first, I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, the forest was teeming with life. Animals, insects, and the occasional rustle of leaves were common. But as the night grew darker, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't that I heard anything specific, just a vague sense of being watched. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that something was off. I tried to ignore it and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, hearing the faint crackling of the fire in the other room. It was so quiet, too quiet, and it made the silence feel suffocating. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound that sent a chill down my spine. It was faint at first, just a soft scratching noise, like something was dragging across the floor. I sat up in bed, straining my ears to listen. There it was again, followed by a thud, like something heavy had been dropped. My heart began to race, and I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the more I listened, the more it didn't feel right. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It sounded like something deliberate. I waited, my breathing shallow, my eyes fixed on the dark doorway of the bedroom. The scratching stopped, but the feeling of being watched intensified. My mind raced through possible explanations, trying to justify the noises, but nothing made sense. After a few more minutes of tense silence, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and slowly crept out of bed, making sure to move quietly so I wouldn't alert whatever was out there. The cabin creaked with each step I took, and I tried to steady my breath as I approached the living room. The fire was low now, just a few embers glowing softly in the fireplace. I swept the flashlight across the room, scanning every corner. Nothing. I sighed in relief, but that relief was short-lived. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd on the floor near the door. It was a small, dirt-covered footprint. Not a human footprint, but something else larger with a wide, flat base and deep grooves along the edges. My blood ran cold. I didn't recognize the print, and I certainly didn't like the idea of whatever made it being so close. I stayed frozen for a moment, trying to think clearly. My first instinct was to leave, but the thought of driving back down that winding road at night, through that dense forest with no one around, was too much to bear. I had no choice but to stay put and figure this out in the morning. I locked the door and barricaded it as best as I could with the furniture in the cabin. Then, I made sure to close all the windows, even though I knew it wouldn't make much of a difference. I spent the rest of the night lying in bed, wide awake, my flashlight by my side. I listened for any more noises, but the rest of the night was eerily silent. At dawn, I was too tired to think clearly, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The strange footprint and the unsettling feeling from the night before wouldn't leave me alone. I gathered my things quickly, determined to get out of the cabin and back to the safety of civilization. But when I stepped outside, I froze. There, scattered across the porch, were more footprints, hundreds of them. The same strange, flat prints, like something heavy had walked all around the cabin during the night. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest as I quickly scanned the surrounding woods. There was no sign of whatever had made them, but the tracks were fresh. I couldn't bring myself to linger any longer. I ran back to my car and got in, slamming the door behind me. As I started the engine, I took one last look at the cabin. It stood there, silent and empty, just like before, but now it felt different. There was something about that place that made my skin crawl, something I couldn't explain. I drove away without looking back. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a small diner for breakfast. The locals didn't seem to think much of the area. When I mentioned the odd footprints, they shrugged it off as nothing more than the usual wildlife. I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they were letting on, but I didn't press the matter. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe. But even now, months later, I can't forget the strange feeling I had that night. The feeling that I was being watched. The feeling that something was out there, lurking in the shadows. I don't think I'll ever go back to that cabin. Some places are meant to stay hidden, and some things are better left alone.